Some cars are styling leaders, but conservative buyers are often leery of huge leaps forward. So here are a few examples of some cars that were slightly ahead of their time. For our first example, we're going to go all the way back to 1934 and the Chrysler Airflow. Streamlining was big news, and several companies were experimenting with streamliners. And some, like Chrysler, were even testing models in wind tunnels. And what they discovered was that most cars of the period were actually more aerodynamic going backwards than they were forwards. They also discovered that a properly streamlined front end with real functional aerodynamics could actually improve mileage by 2 miles per gallon, and hence the Chrysler and DeSoto Airflows were born. But the aerodynamics were not the only improvement to these cars. They also used a partially unitized construction, which when combined with the new framework not only improved structural rigidity, but also rollover safety. And they also shifted basic structural layout, or where the components sat in relation to the axles. Traditionally, the front axle was one of the furthest points forward, directly under the radiator, and the cabin was all the way back, directly over the rear axle. And both the cabin and the front axle were shifted inward. This meant that passengers were no longer riding directly over the rear axle, and the engine was no longer behind the front axle. This meant that you could have a car that was both shorter in overall length and in wheelbase without actually reducing any interior space, while dramatically improving both ride and handling, creating a more balanced weight bias instead of a more common 75% rear weight bias. And they really tried to push the promotion of these new features. They put a traditional sedan body on its existing frame backwards and drove it around town as a publicity stunt to demonstrate the problems with aerodynamics, and created a promotional video rolling the new model down a hill and then driving it away. But the look of the car was not considered pretty. And people even questioned the structural integrity of the new layout. After a couple of years of disappointing sales, they tried to make the grille a little more conservative, but that really failed to have any impact on sales. So by 1938, it was completely restyled to look like a more traditional car of the period, although the underlying layout remained the same, and within the next couple of years would become commonplace in the industry. The next car we're going to look at would be the Kaiser-Frazier cars of 1947, also known as the post-war wonder. When these cars were introduced in 1947, stylistically they left all the major manufacturers in the dust. They had what they called aircraft-inspired styling that included a full fenderless look and even hatchback tailgate combinations. And over the next 2 years, all the major manufacturers were scrambling to catch up stylistically. But once they did catch up, KaiserFrazier was essentially left by the wayside. By the early 50s, the Frazier name was dropped. They expanded into a new small car market and even purchased Willys in an attempt to gain market share. And it wasn't long before the post-war wonder became the post-war blunder. And 1955 would be the last year that Kaiser offered cars in the United States. The early 1950s saw another car that took a huge leap forward in styling, the Studebaker coupes. The bullet-nosed Studebakers that were introduced in the late 1940s did not sell particularly well. Even by putting on a more conservative front end in 1952, the cars were still considered small and stodgy looking. But that all changed in 1953 with the so-called Lowy coupe. These cars were longer, lower, sleeker, particularly when compared to the popular brands of the time. Models from Ford and Chevy and Plymouth didn't even appear to be in the same market segment. Even when compared to European sports cars, the Studebaker coupe still looked sleek. But sleek apparently wasn't what the segment wanted. So in 1956, Studebaker came out with a new standard vehicle that was taller and significantly more conservative. But the sleek coupe wasn't canceled, it was restyled and reintroduced as the Hawk, a sporty coupe where it had very little direct competition in the United States. And with the help of bigger V8s and an optional supercharger, it carried on into the early 1960s. In the 1960s is when General Motors gave us the Toronado. Oldsmobile had traditionally been GM's experimental brand. It was the brand that gave us the first fully automatic transmission. It was the brand that gave us the first mass-produced turbocharged car. And it was the brand that gave us the front-wheel drive, big block, personal luxury coupe. Front-wheel drive itself wasn't new. There were such early adapters as the Citroën Traction Avant and the Cord L29, but there had never been a front-wheel drive like this. This front-wheel drive used Oldsmobile's biggest V8 engine, attached to a modified heavy-duty turbo-hydromatic 400 transmission, attached to a torsion bar front suspension, something that was new for GM, and put it all under something that could only be described as a futuristic body. And although first-year sales were reasonable at nearly 45,000, second-year sales dropped to less than half that. Part of this could have been because Cadillac got its own version of the car with a more elegant yet more expensive design, and part of it might have been because Buick's Riviera in the same market segment remained a more traditional rear-wheel drive into the late 70s. But for whatever reason, the Toronado never gained the reputation of either the Eldorado or the Riviera or most of the other cars in its segment. And for our last car, we're going to go to a car that started to fail before it actually even made it into production, the AMC Pacer. The Pacer was intended to be a car of the future. They say it was designed inside out, starting by designing a cabin around the passengers instead of designing the cabin around the format. So not only did it get this, what was considered futuristic bubble pod styling, but it was also styled around a large rotary engine. Unfortunately, that rotary engine never materialized, and there had to be last-minute redesigns to push the firewall back to allow for a longer, heavier, less powerful straight six. In adding to the awkwardness of the design, there was even a longer two-door wagon body option that included a longer door on the passenger side. And like many of the other cars on this list, in an attempt to save sales, the front end was restyled to try to look more conservative, which arguably made the car less attractive. But in the end, it was just one more model that AMC killed off at the end of the 1970s. Now, some of you may be asking how I couldn't include the Tucker on this list. But I have to ask how cutting edge the Tucker really was. Rear-engine luxury sedan with 3 headlights introduced in 1948, 10 years after the air-cooled rear-engine luxury sedan with 3 headlights that Tatra introduced in 1938, the same nifty little thumb-shift semi-automatic transmission that Cord had used in the 1930s, and sure, it had some interesting safety features and was a very fascinating car, but did it even get the chance to be a flop? Is there anything I missed? Is there any that you agree or disagree with? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks.